Today we're going to talk about the meta after all these various changes. I know True Game Data just put out a video on neck damage. If you want to go ahead and check that out, link it near the top of the description. But we'll be discussing that actual value and how it actually impacts the meta. And we'll just be discussing meta in general. And then I'll be leaving you with a few weapons that maybe you should be using if you're not already using, if you're trying to stay as competitive as possible. If you enjoy the video, hit the like button. Goal in today's video is 7,000 likes. So hopefully you guys can crush that number. And if you're brand new, want to find your way back for more Call of Duty content, double check, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. One thing I want to apologize for is I haven't posted a couple days. I've been having a ton of internet issues. The tech guy doesn't come out until like Wednesday, so I'm trying, but we'll see how it ends up working out. So if you guys are unfamiliar with this site, it is Warzone Ranked, just like it says right here, warzoneRanked.com. That's what it would be when you go to it. When you actually go ahead and check out the section, there are areas for different loadouts, and you can actually see various trends. When Warzone dropped, the higher this number, if this number was all the way up at 1, that would mean that literally everyone in every lobby is grabbing the exact same weapons for their loadout. The lower this number is, that means there's a little bit more variety within the meta. When Warzone dropped back in March, you could see that there wasn't really one. Everyone was trying to figure it out. Not long after people figured out what metas were, those things got nerfed, and then people tried to figure out what the meta was, and it was actually in a really good spot. And then we ended up with the DMR meta, and then we continue going on, and we end up with the Mac 10 meta, Kilo. You know, it goes all the way down, and the meta continues to evolve over time, and that's what we're seeing here within this chart. Right now, we're still in a pretty good spot right here, where there is a pretty solid group of meta. You are allowed to veer outside of that meta, and you're not going to be penalized significantly. And that's what I want to talk about, what makes an actual meta, because I think this is the part where it seems like a lot of people get kind of caught up on what is meta and what isn't. I will say that there is usually a solid group of meta, depending how strong it is. And it's usually a weapon that could be used in multiple game modes. So if you're just a solos person, there's probably certain weapons that'll be a little bit more viable in solos, but probably not in quads. So generally something that is meta is usable in quads, trios, duos, and solos. And a lot of times the weapons, the people don't like making, we only get 10 loadouts. If we had 30 loadouts, maybe you'd have your solo loadouts, your quads. So a lot of times people don't like mixing and matching and all that stuff. So they just keep those tried and true that will work in all of them. Even though like for the longest, the AS Val was probably one of the most dominant solo weapons. You didn't really see that in duos that often, less often in trios, and definitely less often in quads, just because it's not as practical. The other part is there's two different metas usually. There's the meta for all skill levels, which we usually call the easy to use meta. And then we'd have the moderately difficult meta, which is usually medium skilled to high skilled players. And this will exclude the low skilled players. So for example, when the AMAX was 100% like a very good meta, it was the moderate difficulty meta, because if you were a little bit lower skilled, then you would stick to like the Kilo or the Grau or one of these other weapons that doesn't hit as hard, significantly easier to use. But on top of that, if a weapon's easy to use, it's like there's tons of easy weapons to use. It has to be low recoil, and that means that like almost no recoil, which because most of the weapons in the game don't have a ton of recoil, that the guns that have almost no recoil tend to outshine those because they lead to consistency. And if the weapon has a competitive TTK, meaning that it's probably not the best, the second best, the third best, but it's so easy to use that there's a high probability of you getting that individual TTK, then you're going to end up with that weapon potentially being meta for everyone. Because if you go head to head with someone and both guns have a similar TTK, theoretically on paper, if all the shots hit, but one weapon is easier slightly than the other to use, that person's probably going to win the gunfight 9 out of 10 times, because if they both fire at the same time, one is more likely to miss with flinch, more recoil. That person's probably going to lose, because that's usually the difference between TTK. So a lot of times easy to use is one of the more popular reasons what makes a weapon meta. Then when it comes to the moderate skilled, it's usually moderate recoil, not high. It can't be insane. There are tons of weapons in the game that hit ridiculously hard, but their recoil is just a little bit out of whack, or they're kept in check in another way because they don't fit into the solos, duos, trios, quads, like the Scar. TTK is solid. As you'll find out if you go ahead and watch that video on True Game Data put out about neck damage, it has good neck damage, but damage per mag sucks because you only get a 30 round mag. So you always have to factor these things into the equation. We also get, with those, they're usually hard hitting and they have the fastest TTKs. So they're more competitive. So if you're more skilled and you go up against someone who has no recoil, you will win most of the time, but because of the inconsistency of it being a little bit harder to use, if you're a lower skilled player, you're going to penalize too hard. So then you're just going to default to the easy to use weapon. And that's normally how the meta evolves, especially in these types of cases. As we go a little bit further down, we're going to end up with consistency as being important with that one as well, meaning that if you hit them in the chest, the limbs, the head, the TTK isn't changing wildly. That requires you like 3 headshots for this thing to be goated, and otherwise it's kind of like blah. No, it needs to be goated majority of the time if you're able to at least hit your shots. And then that brings us to the neck damage scenario, and there's a few different outliers on this, but it doesn't really change the meta at all. It just solidifies why certain scenarios a weapon ends up being meta and another one doesn't, while on paper statistically it seemed like they should. So what I'll do is go through an example of that when we come through here. So an example, like we talked about the Krig, this is the easy to use meta. Most people will use that because anyone can use it. I can put on a 5-year-old on the controller, barely ever played, they're going to be able to shoot straight with the Krig. That's what that weapon is designed for, and its TTK is the most competitive for the low skill weapons. So this one slightly beats out the Growl. The QBZ doesn't have an upper chest neck multiplier like the Krig does. So that's why it's like, well, why isn't the Krig being used? Or why is the Krig being used over the QBZ? It doesn't make sense. On paper, they seem good. The neck damage ends up being an issue of why the Krig ends up outperforming the QBZ, in addition to the way the damage values are placed. Even though on paper, it sounds like the QBZ should be better than the Krig, it ends up being more consistent to use the Krig because it has another value that'll actually give you more damage, not maybe quite as high as a headshot in most cases, but more than a chest shot. So it's a little bit more forgiving if you throw in a leg shot in there, that you're still going to get a reasonable time to kill, and where it's not going to give you a lower, it's not going to raise the shots to kill where you end up killing slower. Then we have the Kar 98. More popular than the Swiss, even though technically the Swiss ends up outperforming it in almost every category. It's just more people that play Modern Warfare tend to stick with those guns, and the Kar 98 is just easy to use if you've already had all that time invested. Optics are clean even after the Swiss changes, but it is what it is. Then the Bullfrog, it's like what people are kind of like losing hope in what to use, and the Bullfrog just has that ammo capacity, allows you to take on multiple people. You can forfeit a mag. And you can see the KDE is still relatively good there at 1.17. And we're going to talk specifically about how this shifts pretty dramatically. Bullfrog, very easy to use. Some people are even trying to use it as sniper support. And it's relatively effective, even though I wouldn't say it's sniper support meta. And then we have the MAC-10, which has been popular for a while, and the Swiss and the Stoner. You can see a lot of these weapons are Cold War weapons, but that's by design. They want you to get all these guns involved, so you got to buy Cold War to like level them up organically. And then obviously once Vanguard comes out and they got all those new weapons, these weapons will slowly drop down. And instead of the Kar 98 Modern Warfare version, we're probably going to have the Kar 98 Vanguard edition. So it'll be what it is. And you get down a little bit lower, and then when I switch this to KD ratio, it dramatically changes how these things are ranked. So what we'll notice here is when I do this by KD, these are a lot of the weapons that generally higher skill players will use. And it reflects in the KD. Lower skilled players will avoid them, so it doesn't bring down this average KD. So that's kind of what it's like, wow, higher skilled players will probably use these, and this ends up being quote unquote the higher skilled meta. And that's why the OTS is on the top here with an insane 1.64 KD. And you're like, what the hell? Lower skilled players are not able to manage with the weapon. They don't know how to challenge the gunfights appropriately. So they end up avoiding that weapon, and they end up choosing something like the Bullfrog just because it's way, way, way easier to use. It's very consistent, especially now that they've changed the damage profile. So it pretty much does the same damage in terms of TTK. Then we have the MG82, which is incredibly broken in terms of TTK. It still kills wild fast, but only good players are going to be able to use it. Even though they changed the recoil slightly, that's enough to deter people where they're like below average. They're gonna be like, I'm staying away from that. Let me go to my Krig because it's gonna be easier. A higher skill, they can take advantage of that and they will get kills a little bit easier, and that's what inflates that KD. C58, same thing, is my favorite weapon. I think that is like the #1 meta weapon, even after they changed everything. That's my favorite quote unquote meta weapon for long range. And then we have the EM2, which personally I think it's more of a sniper support. It doesn't get a lot of use because that recoil deters people, so the lower skill people just avoid it. And we have the FAL, which makes sense. We got the, a lot of people like that one, but it's a very unforgiving weapon. It requires skill. So lower skill people, they use it once or twice and they avoid it completely. Tech 9. Very, very good, especially when you have the full auto. And I would imagine they're using the full auto here as well. If you actually click on any of these, they'll actually take you to a different page and it'll show the list of attachments. So we can check that out real quick. So when you click on the Tech 9, it'll actually come through over here. We get the Task Force barrel, which seems like universally that's what people are using. Everyone is using the top one is that auto repeater as terms of pick use. Tiger Team Spotlight, Raider stock, and then 48 round mag. So that is like the standard meta build that most people use. There are some higher KD ones, it looks like. We got Task Force. We got the auto repeater, 48 round fast mag. And then we have the Tiger Team Spotlight with the Bruiser. And then it looks like this one below it, they just swap out the Task Force for the Raider stock. So, and then they use the standard barrel. But look at that. You get the option to go ahead and check out those loadouts. And we're going to go through what I would consider the quote unquote meta loadouts right now. I just thought I'd go over that. But one of the things we will talk about is the outliers from the neck damage. So this doesn't really change the meta, but one thing it will show it is it gives reasons that one reason or another people think were chosen. Like we talked about the Krig. There's also the XM4 has a decent neck shot multiplier, the OTS, the Cold War AK-47, the FFAR, Groza doesn't get used, but it does have one. AK-74U doesn't really fit because it's a slow SMG, but it has one. And then the Stoner has one, but the RPD doesn't. And that kind of explains why sometimes this should be easier, that because the RPD kind of hits just as well as the Stoner, even has less recoil, but it technically doesn't hit as hard because it doesn't have a neck damage. And the ones without neck damage, they make sense of why it's like, damn, why was that never meta? RPD, M13, PPSH, Bullfrog, it's like, it's good and then it's not. It's like, what the hell? And they've changed the damage a bunch of times. AN94 does not have one. MP7 and then Kilo. Obviously, I think these are like different values that have changed over time. So we don't know what they were back in the previous metas because no one knew to ever really look for them until they add them to the patch notes that one time. But the AN94, PPSH, and M13 RPD are like, okay, that explains it. It's just not as forgiving as some of these other ones that had these secret damage values that essentially give them a lower TTK more often. That's really what neck damage multipliers are doing. And that kind of explains why those end up being those outliers in the first place. So let's go ahead and check out a couple different loadouts. So the first loadout we'll go ahead and talk about, which is what I would call the lower skilled or pretty much easy to use, anyone could touch, will be the Krig with the Bullfrog. And the Krig is going to be agency, field agent grip, 60 round mag, 3x optic. And then with this one, you either go with the Ranger or the mil spec. This one's kind of like split, really comes down to preference. I normally use the Ranger just because I get the extra mobility in terms of the aim down sight, and the recoil is not a significant difference. So I normally go with the Ranger, but to each their own, you got both options there. When it comes to the Bullfrog, you get the option of not getting a magazine, which saves you an extra attachment that you could put towards the Bruiser. That's why we're seeing the Gru Suppressor, Task Force, Tiger Team Spotlight, Skeleton Stock, which are all great for mobility, range, bullet velocity, and then the Bruiser adds on to the mobility and movement as well. So then you're getting fully stacked. The only downside with this one is sometimes you can lose people in the optics as far as the iron sight. So you could always get rid of that Bruiser and put on like a reflex sight. And there's another way to go, or get rid of the skeleton stock, like just one of the other attachments that'll kind of substitute that one. Now let's go ahead and talk about what are the mid-range, higher skilled weapons. And personally, I think that is the C58 and the OTS. So what we're going to look at here is we got the agency suppressor, Ranger. You could go with the Task Force, but this makes it a little bit slower. Field agent grip, 55 round mag, or the 45. Normally the 45 is enough to get the job done, and then the 3x optic. When it comes to the OTS, there's actually two builds here. That's why I've only put 4 attachments. We got Gru, Task Force, 40 round fast mag, because you got to get those fast reloads in since it only takes about a second. We got the skeleton stock. The last attachment, you can either go with the Serpent, Gru elastic, so either of those to speed up your aim down sight and hurt your sprint to fire, or you can go also with the Tiger Team, which will give you the extra mobility and aiming movement and stuff like that with strafe speed. And those are the two different ways you would go. It really just comes down to, again, preference and how you're going to end up using the weapon. And lastly, what I'd probably use for sniper support, regardless of your skill level, is the Cold War AK-47 with the Swiss for long range, obviously for sniping. I would use it built pretty much this way with the Gru Suppressor, the Spetsnaz grip, the 45 round mag, Serpent grip, and the Microflex LED. For some people, you got better recoil control. Maybe you're on keyboard and mouse, you could get rid of the Spetsnaz grip and you could run on a stock or a Tiger team. But this is the build that I like. It works for me. And that's what I typically enjoy using. When it comes to the Swiss, you got the Grew Suppressor, Combat Recon, 5 milliwatt laser, Bruiser Grip, and then Serpent Grip. And those are kind of how I would stack it for myself. And that ends up being the 3 quote-unquote meta builds for these individual weapons. Hopefully you guys enjoy the video, learn something new. Please do me a favor, hit the like button if you're brand new, want to find your way back. Double check, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Appreciate all the support. Thank you for watching. As always, have a great day.